Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse webinar. I am Lindsay Vellicina. I am going to be your moderator today. I am with Scrum.org, and I am here today with Stephanie Ockerman, one of our professional Scrum trainers. Next slide, please. So I should have mentioned today's topic. So 5 ways to improve your Scrum Teams process. That's our topic for today. And we're going to get into some great stories that Stephanie is going to share with us, along with some live Q&A. And on this slide, you'll see it points you to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's where you will enter all of your questions. And please enter them throughout the webinar. We are saving questions to the end, but we will try to get through as many as we possibly can. So next slide, please. And just an added note, the recording will be available within 24 hours for this session. So who is Scrum.org? So Scrum.org, we are the home of Scrum. We were founded by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum, in 2009. Our mission is to help people and teams solve complex problems by improving how they work through higher levels of professionalism. We are focused on helping people learn through free online resources like today's session, and others, along with our activity-based live training led by our more than 340 professional Scrum trainers around the globe. We also have our professional Scrum certification tests as well to validate your knowledge. We support people wherever they are in their learning journey, and I hope that today's session helps you grow. So with that, I will hand it over to Stephanie to introduce herself and kick us off with the content.
Thank you, Lindsay. My name is Stephanie Ockerman. I am a professional Scrum trainer. I'm a co-active coach. I'm a leader and a traveler, an adventurer, and many other things. I am the founder of Agile Socks, and we are a training, enablement and agility training and enablement company. And so if you go to my website, agilesocks.com, I do write quite a bit, in addition to the book that you see up here on the slide, Mastering Professional Scrum, that I co-authored with one of my colleagues, Simon Reindl. I also blog and create short videos. So there's lots of additional content available, in addition to my more in-depth learning opportunities like live virtual training, as well as my self-guided online courses, because I don't want to just teach people Scrum. I want to help them advance in their journey. All right. So feel free to sign up for my newsletter if you're interested in more content, more opportunities to go deeper. And with that, I'm going to jump right into our topic for today. Our topic is 5 ways to improve your Scrum team process. And I always have to start out whenever I start talking about topics like this with the reminder that there are no best practices in Scrum. There are no best practices because we're dealing with complexity. We are dealing with unpredictability. However, there are some approaches that we can apply to navigate in any context. So if you're looking for silver bullets, you're in the wrong place. But if you are seeking to deepen your agile mindset, to get some inspiration and some ideas, and that will help you get curious and creative in your own environment, I think you will get a lot out of this. Okay. The other thing I want to set the stage with is team process means a lot of different things. And be sure to consider all the different aspects of your team process, right? So Scrum is a framework that the Scrum team uses to define their process within the boundaries of that framework to enable healthy empiricism and healthy teamwork. So think about things like, how effectively are we actually leveraging our Scrum events? How effectively do we leverage our Scrum artifacts? Those are aspects of your team process. How we do product backlog refinement, that is a big aspect, right? Scrum does not define that for you. We have to figure that out on our own. It's likely to change over time and be very different from one team to the next. How do we actually get work done during a sprint, right? What is that workflow of how we get a product backlog item to done throughout the sprint? That is process. How do we share knowledge? How do we share our growth, our skill growth as a team? How do we build quality in? And how do we think about doing that more effectively and doing that sooner to manage risk? Again, that's an aspect of team process. How do we identify impediments? How do we identify opportunities to improve, not just within a Scrum team, but branching out and looking at organizational agility? So many things are encompassed in team process. And what I'm going to go through today are things that you can apply to many different aspects of your team process. And as Lindsay mentioned, the way I'm going to go through this is I'm going to give you a little bit of an example to help illustrate each one of these concepts. All right. So diving in, number one, we need to increase the breadth and the depth of transparency. So everything in Scrum is designed around enabling effective empiricism, and transparency is a piece of that. It's one of the pillars of empiricism so that we can effectively inspect and adapt as we learn, as things change. And so it's not just about, do we have transparency? Yes, no, this isn't a binary question. The question is, how deep does that go? How broad is the transparency? So a few things here, right? We need to make our process visible. We need to make the outcomes visible, but it's more than just making things visible. We need to actually have conversations that help us have a greater shared understanding. We need to be generating insights as a Scrum team, things that are going to help us actually see interconnections, things that are going to help us get to the actual root causes of our challenges so that we can improve. So a story I'll tell you here. Working with a team where the organization required the team to complete specific documentation for our transition to support. So a little backstory, this was obviously part of a bigger issue here with the way the company was dividing and really separating product development work from the support work. And that was leading to poor customer experiences. It was leading to finger pointing, the blame game whenever things did go wrong, and really a lot of frustration all around. And so that was a larger organizational impediment, but we were going to chip away at it over time. And so I'm going to give you a snippet of that story to illustrate how we took a small step towards improvement. So as I mentioned, the problem we were focusing on, the challenge we were focusing on was we were required to fill out this document that was around our release notes to give to support. But we knew that this document wasn't very useful in truly creating that shared understanding, right? And truly understanding the changes at the level needed to really be effective. And we also didn't want to just say like, oh, let's put more detail in the document, because that wasn't the thing that was going to make it better. And support did complain. They said this isn't sufficient. Of course, right? Because they're saying, hey, you're putting us in this position. We need more information. But again, we knew that just adding more detail to that document wasn't really going to create that understanding and generate the insights needed. So we approached this with a couple of different ideas. We said, hey, you know what? Like, we understand this is challenging. We would like to bring you in more to our work and do that sooner. And so we said, could we have one representative from the support team start attending our sprint reviews? And so that way they would get an understanding, they would see these things in practice, they would understand more of how customers were expected to be using new features and functions. And so the other piece we said was, we would also, instead of just filling out a document and submitting it to you, we would like to hold a working session with you during the week before we actually are going to release something to production. And we would specifically gear that conversation towards what a support team would need to understand about how we are implementing features and functions, and how what questions and what things they would expect to get calls about. And of course, this would offer an opportunity for us to have a real conversation, ask questions, answer those questions. And so both of these ideas, we approach them as experiments. We didn't say like, hey, let's change everything. This is the way we're going to do it going forward. We said, hey, could we try this for a few sprints and assess the impact, see if it's made anything better, see if the experience is better for the support team. And ultimately, we continued with this approach, right? We got buy-in because we said, we're just going to do this for a few sprints. Let's see how this goes. But it did actually help. People liked the real conversation. And so, of course, we didn't have a perfect working session with support the first time, but over time, we tweaked the effectiveness of those sessions. We tweaked how we did the support documentation as well to make that more clear and effective. And ultimately, this did lead to fewer production support issues and fewer questions having to come back to the Scrum team after we had done a release. And ultimately, that made us have a better relationship with the people that did the support for the product. And those two small changes actually helped build trust, and that set the stage for some of the bigger changes that we moved towards that would actually help bridge that divide that we were experiencing in the organization between development and support. Okay, so that's really just one simple example of where we knew we needed to create, we needed to deepen the transparency here. And in order to improve team process, right, we have to have transparency to the process. So keep that in mind. And Scrum is providing you a minimal level of empiricism, right? That minimum level of transparency if you just, follow the rules, check off the boxes. But we want to go beyond just doing Scrum. We want professional Scrum. And much more is possible when teams truly embrace empiricism, when teams truly understand how their process is affecting their outcomes. And so I want to leave you with a few questions. So these are some questions I've put together that can really help your team explore opportunities related to increasing the depth and breadth of transparency in your real world. So I won't read all of these to you, but this will be in the PowerPoint deck that you can download. But just a few examples, right? And a lot of times we don't think about this first one. How lively and rich are our conversations, right? Because again, this is about shared understanding, generating new insights. And so this question is very open-ended, and it hits on things in a different way than we're typically used to talking about transparency. Other questions, what assumptions are we making, right? So that can kind of drive out things that are maybe assumed, not being said, right? That are made implicit. And how are we validating those assumptions? All right. When do we tend to get surprised? What could we make transparent sooner that would lead to fewer surprises, or at least bring those to the surface earlier so we can deal with them? Okay. So now I'm going to move us to number 2. Apply lean principles. So what I have up here are what I look at as the simplified lean principles. So you can, of course, take this deeper, but really what I'm going to focus on here is maximizing value, minimizing waste, and maximizing flow. And these 3 principles are interrelated. So maximizing flow means we move items, i.e. value, right? When I say an item, I mean an item that's creating some sort of value through our process as quickly as possible without risk to quality or customer satisfaction. Removing waste is one way that we can do this. And waste, we can look at it as anything that's not adding value to our customer. So when we assess our process through the lens of the lean principles, right, we can look for those signs of waste and look for those opportunities to maximize the flow of value. Some common sources of waste that you'll run across and you might be noticing in your environment: building things people don't want, building things that maybe we thought they wanted it, maybe they even asked for it, but they're not using it, it's not meeting their need. Task switching, interruptions, distractions, partially done work, poor quality, unnecessary or ineffective processes or documentation. And so the story I'll tell you here is a team I worked with we were a large content management system. So an internal system but it was used by our entire organization. So it supported, not just internal activities, but it also supported customer facing activities. And there were quite a few integrations. Plus, in the organization, there were a lot of larger cross company initiatives happening that were going to be impacting our product. And so the challenge that we were facing, the situation was that project managers and other Scrum teams would reach out to our team whenever they knew that we were going to be needed to help them with an initiative. And so they would reach out to essentially the developer they knew, right? The developer they had worked with in the past, whoever, they thought could give them some information. And so developers were getting invited to, project kickoff meetings. They were getting asked for high-level estimates. They were getting asked questions, even related to things like integration. And so this was interrupting the work of the sprint, and it was causing, task switching, a form of waste. And it also was making it challenging to truly have transparency to our potential future work. Okay. So, first of all, how we approach this, I want to point out that Scrum actually was the starting point for us. So the Scrum framework provided a starting point to help us see this challenge for what it was and start to move towards a solution. So what does Scrum tell us? We need to have transparency to the work that is planned for the future, right? And our product owner needs to be accountable for maximizing the value of the product, right? And that happens through having an ordered, transparent product backlog. So we needed visibility to all of this future potential work, and our product owner needed to be the one who was empowered to make decisions around that work in terms of what was making it into the product backlog and the order of it. So we agreed as a Scrum team that in order to kind of honor those boundaries, those aspects of the Scrum framework that are there to help us be effective, we would, whenever somebody reached out, we would respond by letting them know our intake process for new work. And, I don't mean sending them some big long document. I mean, just a pretty simple statement around, hey, like, thanks for sending this, here's the best way, here's how you get on our radar, and we made it simple. And we made sure that new requests, new desires, those were going through our product owner. And then what we would do is we had regularly scheduled product backlog refinement sessions. And so our product owner would also use those sessions as an opportunity to bring up any new initiatives, new requests for high-level estimates or just informational requests before something, was actually approved and budgeted. So he would bring those in, and then we, as a Scrum team, would have the opportunity to discuss, well, what do we know about that? What assumptions are we making, and think about how best to handle it. So we didn't just say, no, we're not attending, these sessions that you want us to come to. But what we did do is we made sure we understood the work enough, and we made sure that when we did send somebody to a meeting to talk about new future work, we made sure we knew the purpose of that meeting and that we had the right person attend. So sometimes it was the product owner. Sometimes it needed to be a more technical discussion, and sometimes it didn't quite make sense to even discuss yet. And our product owner would be the one to communicate that. And so again, just one example of where we leveraged the lean principles. We were able to remove some sources of waste in our process. And also note, we were also increasing the depth and breadth of transparency. And so this is a small thing that simply started by noticing that the status quo of just how things were done in the organization and had always been happening for our Scrum team, noticing that that's actually impacting our ability to deliver value. So we questioned it and we sought a better way to meet that need. Okay. And so looking at a few questions that'll help you think about how do you explore in your team, applying the lean principles. For every activity we perform, what's the purpose of it, right? In other words, what benefits do we gain and how does that contribute to value delivery? And what could make that activity more valuable? And so things we've done in the past, at some point, maybe they don't become needed anymore, or we need to change how we do them to truly get the value out of the activity. asking ourselves questions like, are we building the right things? And how do we know? So a few more questions up here that you'll be able to think about. How does this fit in our context? So moving forward to number 3. Number 3 is apply teamwork, the concepts of teamwork, improve teamwork, right? And when I say apply, right, the aspects of teamwork specifically that I'm thinking about here are cross-functionality, collaboration, and self-management, right? How effectively are we leveraging these concepts to improve our teamwork? So in Scrum, we're always seeking and evolving our teamwork. And so that's going to change over time as well. Okay. And so when we think about, there's so much opportunity here is one of the things. This is a big concept. We get into some of this in teaching of like, well, what is functionality? What does collaboration really look like? How do we have effective self-management? So these are big topics. And I want to give you an example again of thinking about how can we apply this to improve our process. So I'm going to share a pretty simple example, something that I think is kind of common based on my experiences. I was working with a team and we were doing a pretty good job of consistently having that done increment by the end of the sprint. However, there was a little bit of this like urgency at the end, right? A flurry of activity, noticing some stress amongst the team at the end of the sprint to actually get there. And we also would frequently have some items started, but not done. We still had a done increment, but we had started some work that didn't make it into that increment. So in our sprint retrospectives, we would look at information that showed us how our work flowed through the sprint. And we could see that sprint by sprint, we were continuing to have some partially done work. And of course, I'm the Scrum Master and I want to like jump straight to like, this is a problem, we need to fix this. But again, I had to like think about, well, what does the Scrum team need, right? And I also want to let them own their process. And so thinking about how do I help them understand this better and how do we make the impacts of this more transparent? So at first, the Scrum team didn't really see a problem with this, but over time, they did start to notice the waste this was creating. And it was more that they didn't need data to show them that. What they needed was to experience the impact and how they were doing their work. They needed to actually see it and recognize like, oh, this is actually creating some waste for us, and see that need to maybe work differently, do something differently. And so ultimately, this did come up in our sprint retrospectives, and the team decided, I talked about WIP limits, work in progress limits, and I encouraged and I kind of brought in some, hey, there's some tools, there's some practices. And so I did kind of come into a teaching mode around that. But ultimately, I do want to point out the team decided not to have formal WIP limits. But rather they just wanted to be more conscious of the amount of work they had in progress every day. And so this decision informed the conversation they had in their daily scrums. And it also became a team working agreement. So when somebody finished something that they've been working on and was ready to take on something else, they would look at the sprint backlog and they would ask team members, is there something I could help you with before I should start something new? Right? Is there some way I can help out with, the quality aspect? Is there, something we could pair on? Is there a piece you want me to take a look at or an activity I can pick up? And so again, it's a simple thing. And I like to point out that the Scrum team came to that solution, and one, the problem itself emerged through experience, and they owned that solution. And this simple thing, it didn't just reduce the waste the team had been noticing. What it meant was there was more time and energy focused on delivery of a valuable, useful increment every sprint. Okay. We weren't starting something, having to put it back in the product backlog. And then, when it comes back into the sprint, from planning the next sprint or a future sprint, even if it didn't bubble up to the top of the product backlog, we didn't have that let me get back into the mode. Like, is this different? Has anything changed? What did we do? What was left? So they recognize that. And the developers actually, through this, were sharing knowledge and growing their skills by working more collaboratively, by having more of that focus on the team outcomes and that intentionality around not having that partially done work that they realized was preventing them from delivering the level of value they could deliver every sprint. And so notice we're using the lean principles here as well, right? So these concepts can build on each other and they are interrelated. And so we were using lean principles by minimizing waste, maximizing flow. And this is an example where, again, I didn't show up as the Scrum police and I didn't just teach the theory around waste, but rather I was creating space to have the conversations that enabled, I'm going to reference number one, a deeper level of transparency to the situation so that they could generate insights and ultimately take more ownership of improving their process. So do I think WIP limits are great? Do I think even leveraging, Kanban itself is great? It can be very complementary to Scrum. Yes, I do. I think that's great, but they are not best practices for every team. And there is so much value in letting your team take ownership and supporting them in discovering their own solutions. And so let's look at some questions that can help us explore in our own team context. So when we think about teamwork, we can ask ourselves questions about how skills are dispersed across the Scrum team, how we share knowledge across a Scrum team. And it's also important, I think, to look at the trends here, right? Like, what have we been doing? Have we been doing nothing, right? Is what we've been doing, is that having the impacts we've desired? Also thinking about as simple as noticing how often do we ask for help? How often do we offer help? Okay. So again, more questions up here to explore. Another big one is how often do we get surprised towards the end of the sprint, realizing we're at risk of not having a done increment that meets our sprint goal, and how could we learn this sooner? So that was one of the big questions we were asking ourselves that led us towards our solution. Okay, so let's move to number 4. So number 4, leverage commitments effectively. Okay. So the 2020 Scrum Guide was updated. The 2020 Scrum Guide update, I should say, is where the concepts of commitments became formalized. Each artifact has a clear commitment. And there's a reason we want that commitment, right? It actually helps to create the focus we need and show us greater transparency to our progress. So for the product backlog, our commitment is the product goal. For the sprint backlog, our commitment is the sprint goal. And for our increment, the commitment is the definition of done. And again, it's not about just having these things in place and ticking off the boxes and saying, yep, we're doing it. It's about how effectively we are using these commitments. And so why are these important? Just again, we're dealing with complexity and unpredictability. We cannot perfectly plan, even within the time horizon of a sprint. And new ideas, new needs, new desires, new issues and challenges will always be coming at us. So we need to have something meaningful to focus on. And by having that focus, we can get a more clear understanding of our progress towards achieving that meaningful thing that we're focusing on, right? So there's transparency. And this is going to enable effective inspection and adaptation. All right. And so just as a reminder on these, right, that definition of done, that's our baseline of quality. It's how we actually know we have a useful, valuable increment by the end of the sprint. And again, this is the entire point of Scrum, right? Every sprint delivering a useful, valuable increment. And that is what gives us our ultimate transparency to our progress. Okay. Our sprint goal is giving us that objective that we're aiming towards in the current sprint. And then our product goal is giving us an objective that we're aiming towards on a longer time horizon beyond a sprint. So let me tell you the story for this example. So what I'm noticing, this is more of like a general example I want to offer you because it's so common. At least I'm noticing it a lot in the classes I'm teaching and the teams that I'm coaching. So I keep hearing, even in my PSM, my PSPO, and even like the advanced PSM2 classes, like we have all of these stakeholder requests coming at us. Everybody wants everything now. We know some of these things aren't as valuable, or we really shouldn't be working on them next, but typically it's whoever yells the loudest, right? Whichever stakeholder yells the loudest. It's like, oh, this is just difficult to manage. So that shows up in a lot of ways, but essentially that's what I'm hearing a lot of. And I ask them, I say, well, do you have a product goal? What's your product goal? And many people don't. So yes, this was introduced a year ago in the 2020 Scrum Guide update, but I'm noticing that people still aren't using it at all even. And maybe some people have a product goal, but they're not really leveraging it to inspect or adapt. Okay. So the thing I want to point out here is that when you have a clear product goal, it is easier to say no or not now when you are getting these stakeholder requests that are not in alignment with that product goal. And every sprint, you and your stakeholders can see tangible progress towards that bigger goal. And by having transparency to where we are headed, it's easier to see when it might be time to shift our focus as our environment changes and as we learn more every sprint, right? And the sprint goal and the definition of done are also helping us create that sufficient focus and enable transparency to progress, right, within that time horizon of a sprint. And so when we use these effectively, when we use these commitments effectively, all of them are helping us identify potential issues sooner and help us make better decisions. And so this is going to give us more runway, more time, more space to respond to change, to respond to new information, and ultimately to manage our risk. And that gives us the ability to get creative about adapting our plan, all while maintaining focus on what really matters and truly enabling the benefits of Scrum. Right? So if you're not using a product goal or any of the commitments really, or you're recognizing that, are we really using it effectively? Are we gaining the benefits of why these things are in the Scrum Guide? This is going to be an easy action for you to take back and work with your Scrum team. And so for this one, put together a few questions here. So asking ourselves, how are we actually leveraging our definition of done throughout the sprint? Is it helping enable this shared understanding of our baseline of quality and transparency to progress every single day? When and how do we talk about our product goal? What tangible progress towards our product goal can we see over the past few sprints, right? And based on our answer to these questions, we might realize like, oh, maybe our product goal is unclear. Maybe it's too vague, or you know what, maybe it's too specific and it's actually limiting our creativity, right? So we should have kind of this balance of enough focus, but also enough flexibility so that we're not kind of limiting the potential innovation and the potential options. So this is never like this is exactly what it should look like type of conversation. It's kind of a, how well is this helping us conversation, and looking at, are we getting enough of this and enough of that? All right. So next up, moving on to number 5. Number 5 is run small, smart experiments. And this is to help us tackle our bigger challenges and also maybe overcome some fear and help us better manage our risk and be able to learn sooner, right? So thinking about like, sometimes tackling these bigger challenges feels hard because we don't know where to start. we're unsure sometimes what to even do or how to start approaching it, right? Or we feel like we need to come up with the perfect plan and we need certainty that it's going to work. So when we apply this idea of running small, smart experiments, that helps us kind of move beyond some of those worries or fears. And so asking ourselves, what are we trying to learn, is helpful to make us think about like, oh, this isn't permanent. We're trying to learn something. Why don't we try this? Let's see what happens. And then we can come back and assess it and decide if we should keep going or if we need to pivot or we need to try something entirely different. All right. So that mindset, that approach just really can change the energy of a room and change the conversation and open up creative ideas. So the example I'll give you for this one is I was working with a large proprietary vendor software product, and we did not have any test automation. And there was already quite a bit built into this product. It had existed for years. And so, the team was aware that this was a source of waste. Like they were aware that it required a lot of effort to do manual testing. And we recognized it was getting harder and harder to sufficiently regression test as the product kind of grew and grew, became more complex. And this, of course, was actually impacting our customers. Quality issues did make it to production, and that would, of course, then interrupt the work in future sprints. So we knew we needed to address this, but it felt so big, right? It felt like such a big undertaking, not just in terms of the actual amount of work, effort to do it, but there was also a significant learning curve for most of our team members. So we asked ourselves, what would we need to learn to give ourselves a sense of how big this even is? What could be a first step to start learning? Well, we needed to choose a test automation tool. That was a starting point we identified. And we needed to make sure it would work with our platform. And we also wanted to understand it better, right? We needed to start learning. So we picked one small thing to automate, and we ran a pilot with 2 different test automation tools with the goal of learning how those tools worked, right? And making a decision of what would best meet our needs and expectations of test automation. And so we made this transparent in our product backlog, right? We talked about the value of doing this, of building this out and running this experiment. And we showed the results in our sprint reviews. We talked about what we learned and the value of continuing to invest in test automation. And so once we made the decision on which tool, then we assessed, well, there's so many things we could automate. Where do we begin? And so we said, well, we looked at what aspects should we focus on first, right? Where do we tend to see maybe more issues? What's going to get us our biggest bang for the buck? And we started just adding these as small slices of value, product backlog items in our product backlog. And we had agreed that we needed to invest in this aspect of quality that would ultimately help us deliver better value, more value, in the end, in the longer run. And we agreed to take on one small aspect of test automation and deliver value in that space every sprint. And again, the team came to this need on their own. But again, transparency is coming into play here. Without having visibility to the impacts of continuing to just do things the way we always did them, we were able to see the cost and the business and the customer impacts that we were seeing of not changing, right? Those are the things that helped drive us to have the sense of urgency that we have to do something. Let's begin. This created a helpful pressure and attention around, we've got to do something. And so I was really just offering, as a Scrum Master, I was offering some facilitation to help them think about smaller, smarter experiments to get going and get learning, and to be smart about how they were investing in test automation, iteratively and incrementally. And so here are some questions that you could think about exploring with your team in order to see ways to run small, smart experiments. Things as simple as asking, what is our biggest worry about this? What is keeping us up at night? What do we need to learn that's going to guide us in our next steps? Right? What are the business impacts of continuing to live with this impediment? All right. So those are the 5 ways. And so I do want to leave you with some final words before we jump into questions. You're probably noticing, right? These things build upon each other. And so we started with talking about increasing the breadth and depth of transparency. Transparency is a Scrum Master's #1 tool. And I also want to point out that this stuff is hard. I'm giving you tiny stories, right? But there's a lot more, it was a lot of effort. There's a lot more things, right? We could go on for days and days actually getting into the details of how these things unfolded. And it can be helpful to have the support of an experienced coach and a mentor to guide you as you're navigating in your context. And so also the piece of that is our personal leadership skills are a huge part of how we are showing up, right? Am I showing up wanting to fix this problem? Am I showing up as a Scrum Master stressed out about this, right? Or am I showing up open and curious and committed to serving the Scrum team in the organization, right? How do I show up as a servant leader? Because that is going to impact my ability to navigate and my ability to create the impact that I aim to have. And so what we just went through, team process, this is actually just one dimension of a model I use. So a model that I co-developed called the Model for Agility Enablement. And I use this with my coaching clients, and it's based on decades of experience in terms of like, what are these common threads? What is a common approach? What would help us be able to kind of see the whole while also kind of zooming out, zooming in, and then determining, well, what should we focus on next? Okay. And I'm actually hosting a free masterclass to actually dive deeper into this model. So looking at the whole model and seeing how to apply it to navigate in any context. All right. So feel free. There's information about how to sign up for that. It's scheduled for November 30th. And I'm also going to be launching that a more in-depth program that's going to actually help people have the support and guidance they need if they're kind of alone in their organization and don't have a lot of other mentors and Scrum Masters around them to really help them go deeper into the Agile mindset and grow themselves, and including their personal leadership skills, so that they can better support their Scrum teams and organizations. So feel free to sign up for my newsletter if you are looking to find out more information about that. All right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay to start our Q&A period.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Stephanie. That was great. So there are a lot of questions here. So we will do our best to get through as many as we can. But rest assured, I will be sharing the full question list with Stephanie. So she'll be able to address these questions after the session at some point. So with that, let's dive in. So this first question here, it came in at the very beginning when you were going over your number 1. Can you really improve or adapt without getting clear what went wrong and therefore play the blame game?
That's a great question, because you probably not. We do have to get to root cause analysis, right? And so, there's an aspect of making it not about, so I guess root cause analysis, I think, is the way that we are increasing the breadth and depth of transparency to make it not about whose fault was it, but more about like, okay, well, we're in this together and we all want the best thing, right? Like we want to improve our customers' experiences. We don't want them to have quality issues. And you know what? We want to love our work too. And we don't want to be frustrated. We don't want interruptions. We don't want to feel like we're not in a position to not be able to support this tool properly, right? So kind of bringing some empathy and kind of realigning around, okay, we're all in this together and we're going to get to the bottom of this and try to figure out what can we improve. So I think the idea is like understanding where our opportunities for improvement is different than saying whose fault is this. And so again, personal leadership skills are a big aspect of how these things unfold. and how we create the real impact we're trying to have. Because a lot of times we may come in with the best of intentions, but if we're not really aligned internally and we're still kind of coming in with our own assumptions and judgments about people, we might say the words that are right, but it comes across as blaming and judgmental. So yeah, I think it is an important aspect. And so it can be tricky to navigate, but I think about focusing on, let's get to the root cause of this, because, hey, nobody's happy with the situation. Let's get better. And then let's own where, we have opportunities to improve, right? Owning our impact is a big piece of it. Being willing to say, yep, that's something we can do better. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephanie. Very good point. So next question comes from Russ. My team is having issues accepting the numbers when the process is not going well. As a Scrum Master, I've received feedback not to tell them when they are behind in the sprint. How do you remain transparent and yet uplift the team when the current situation is a bit bleak?
Wow. Okay. I love the context that you shared in that question, just because it's helpful to get a feel, because there's many different ways, but to get a feel for like the emotional state of, of the situation and how people might be feeling right now. So what it seems to me, I guess the first place I'll start with this is, I am also not about, and I learned this the hard way, I should say, is just shoving data at a team and being like, look, you can see, right? You can see this is going wrong, is not as effective, right? Like, and I've done that, and realized and shifted my approach over time and made it a little bit more around like, well, what information would be helpful for you to see? Like what, and so the question, kind of a question you could take back to your team is, I'm here to serve you. And, we do know like that we're going to have a better chance of successfully delivering useful, valuable increments of product if we understand our progress every day, right? That's the purpose of the daily Scrum. So we can teach by and reference, right? Like what is the purpose of the elements of Scrum to help reinforce, like, why are we talking about this? Why does this matter? How is this helpful? So there's a teaching component there. And then asking them like, what information do you need? What would be helpful to you? And so I tell this story a lot in my training classes where I was with a team that had a whole lot of challenges in kind of the teamwork space and the process space and then all over the board. And it's one of those like, well, where do we focus is always a challenge. So the part of this I want to point out though, is I thought it would be helpful to them to have a burn down chart. I thought, that's not prescribed by Scrum, but it's such a common practice. And I was newer as a Scrum Master. And I was like, well, surely we need a burn down chart that will help them understand that they need to talk more about how they're doing their work on a daily basis. And over time, like I knew I wasn't supposed to update it. And so like after they did the daily Scrum, which I was just observing, I'd be like, hey, does anybody want to update your burn down chart? Like it's right there. Anybody want to update it? And they would just stare at me. And I was kind of like, okay, this is awkward. And then I'd go update it. And over time, like fast forward, we were working on a lot of other challenges, not just the effect, that one thing. And over time, like the team became a more cohesive team. They started to trust each other more. They started to actually have better transparency to the value of each individual product backlog item that was part of their sprint backlog. We started using sprint goals, right? We improved our definition of done. People were collaborating better, right? There were so many things. And one day I realized like they're doing awesome. And you know what? They still don't use that burn down chart. They don't need it. That is not the thing that's going to help them understand their progress. But all those other things, those other ways that we were improving as a Scrum team actually helped achieve that impact. And so I realized like that burn down chart was for me, and this isn't about me. And so I realized that's not like a perfect answer to solve your specific problem. And it probably could be like hey, have like a whole hour coaching session and conversation to uncover more. But I like to share that example of where, am I doing this for me or am I doing this for them? And then maybe I need to look more towards what do they need? And so there might be some things we need to tighten up in terms of our understanding of Scrum and empiricism and how these things help us. And another way to go might be, because this is one other thing that I think had a huge impact on that Scrum team, is how do I teach them to have techniques that help them have a better conversation in their daily Scrum, right? To shift it from like a status update to actually more of a real lively conversation that we're kind of passionate about as a group around, what value are we delivering? Where are we at in terms of having a done increment? Like what's our real progress towards that sprint goal? So how do I teach them some techniques that I offer as like, hey, do we want to try this? And so again, treating it as an experiment to say like, one, I'm not dictating your process, but I'm offering, right, some ways that can help you get more out of this event and feel better about, feeling more confident in your success on a daily basis. So those are just some ideas that I'll throw out there, and I hope that is helpful.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, so next question. Do you have any suggestions to convince the product owner to I'm reading this funny now, to not try to maximize the utilization of the Scrum team, but to maximize the value of the product itself?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So, the question in itself is sort of recognizing there is a little bit of a difference in how that product owner understands the purpose of his or her role, right? Like the accountability of the product owner is to maximize the value of the product. And so this might be an opportunity to realign, go back to the Scrum guide. And so for me, I also like to tell stories and give examples of where maximizing utilization does not in any way help us actually maximize the value of the product. In fact, it can have a negative effect, right? And so like talking, using some examples, and they don't even have to be Scrum examples, by the way. So if you're newer to Scrum and you're like, I don't have those examples and stories, you can use any example from your past experience. And so kind of pointing out that, this utilization is an interesting one. This comes up in a lot of classes in a lot of different ways. And sometimes I'm very direct in working with leaders and product owners or anybody really who kind of brings this up. And I say, we're not building widgets, right? Like this is complex work. And so we need to have space for innovation and creativity. And so like approaching in a simple way that's a starting point. But there are some broader, bigger things, I should say, to think about. And so asking ourselves, what measures do we use that give us a perspective around our ability to deliver value? And so, I don't always convince people, that the kind of their approach is not necessarily going to create the impact they're desiring. I'll approach that conversation, but then I'm also going to be open and be like, okay, so how can we have more information? How can we have more transparency and visibility to the value we're delivering? Right. And so I would challenge to say like, hey, let's make sure we have some value measures that are actually helping us know. So that's a subtle redirection, like in another area, but it's something that absolutely is going to help us have the transparency we need to come to alignment and to truly make progress towards something that matters, which is maximizing the value of the product. And what could unfold there is a realization from the product owner that focusing over here, I'm never even going to think about utilization again, because this is great. Like this helps me understand, this gives me more transparency. And I'm actually focusing on meaningful things that, delight customers. So those are just a few ideas. Again, it's a big, gnarly kind of complex situation. So probably not a full perfect answer or silver bullet, because unfortunately we don't have any of those, but those are just a few opportunities that might be available.
Okay, great. Thanks. This next question, what if your team doesn't want to take ownership? How do you encourage them to do so?
Hmm. Oh, another big question. Okay. So there's a lot of things that could be at play here. So I'm going to make some assumptions, of course, as I answer this based on my experiences. I often find that if it's not so much that teams don't want to take ownership, and I kind of have to check myself. That's an example of like, I have thought that in the past, right? Like they just don't want to, like they don't want to take responsibility, right? But again, I have to check myself. I got to work on my personal leadership skills and think through like, wait, I'm judging them. I'm making assumptions. So maybe what's driving the behaviors, right? And so what I've seen a lot of times is this tends to be because of past history in the organization where people have been micromanaged. And if we don't have things like clear valuable goals that we're aiming towards in an organization, right? If our leaders focus on setting goals that are and measuring people's performance by like what they think they could control, which is deliver this thing, deliver 50 of these, or here's the exact way to do it, right? People are going to be like, okay, just tell me what to do and how to do it. Right. So I have empathy for people in those situations. And so this could be a much broader problem that isn't so much about the individuals not being willing to take ownership. It might be about the environment they're in that is created unhealth and, kind of an unhealthy teamwork type of environment. And so that might be an area to look at. I also always, when it comes to teamwork, things that are related to, really getting to that point where we're owning our process, we're taking responsibility, we're thinking about our shared results as a team, not just I got my thing done, right? Like whenever we're dealing in that world of cross-functional, self-managing, collaborative, I do a lot of, I make sure I'm also having enough one-on-one coaching conversations, right? So establishing a relationship with my team members, talking about like, what is coaching, having an alliance around individual coaching, as well as at the team level. And so that helps build trust to some degree. And you're giving people an opportunity you're giving yourself an opportunity to truly support the individual and better understand what are they struggling with? What do they want? Right? Like what do they feel is holding them back? And being able to support people in that capacity, I think goes a long way. So I would look organizationally, there's probably some interesting things that have happened and maybe are still happening. And then also kind of zooming in and really working with the individuals one-on-one to better understand them, understand what's motivating them, and what they really want and what they need, and showing them that you care. You're not there to just judge them, because it can also feel like that sometimes when people are kind of put in and like, now you have a Scrum Master, you're doing Scrum. It's like, who is this person? What do they want from me? So just a few ideas that I think are likely useful in those scenarios.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. So we are just about at time. Unfortunately, I don't think we have any more time for any more of these questions because they're all like really good, deep questions that we have here. So Stephanie, I'll share them with you after this session, and then you can go ahead and address them. Thank you, everyone, for being such a great interactive audience. There's some really great things that have come up. So if we can go to the next slide, just want to encourage you all to continue your learning. So we do have learning paths on the Scrum.org website. Feel free to check those out. A bunch of free resources, webinars like this one, as well as other things like case studies, white papers, other videos, things of that nature. So feel free to check those out. And then next slide. And please stay connected with us on social media, through our blog. We run these webinars about 2 or 3 times a month. So feel free to check out our other webinar calendar on our website. That's about all I got. So thank you, Stephanie, so much for today's session. We will send these questions over and get them addressed.
Fantastic.
So have a great rest of your day, everyone, and scrum on.